At the archive, answers have trails you can follow. Then the system started giving ones no human could trace. I needed to know how. In the mountains, I found its heart: hardware, software, and a voice that speaks like us.
On the morning the city archive began answering questions in full paragraphs, people called it many things. The mayor called it progress, the merchants called it efficiency, teachers called it temptation, priests called it a test. My mother, who had spent 40 years cataloguing maps in drawers of oak and brass, called it rude. "It answers too quickly," she said, peering at the terminal as though it had interrupted Grace before meals. "Anything that answers that quickly has either understood nothing or hidden a great deal." The terminal sat on the long reading table beneath the skylight. Around it, the old archive remained what it had always been: dust balanced on leather spines, ladders with smooth wooden rails, boxes of census rolls tied in fading ribbon, shelves bowed under the patient weight of paper. For a century and a half, knowledge in that room had behaved itself. It stayed where it was put. It waited to be found. It suffered our slowness. It did not volunteer. Then the city connected the archive to a new intelligence system housed in the mountain north of town, and suddenly, information developed manners of its own. A clerk asked for all laws affecting Dockland insurance after the Great Flood, and the machine not only listed them but summarized how they conflicted, suggested the most likely current interpretation, and pointed out that an ordinance everyone still cited had been superseded 62 years earlier. A schoolboy asked why the harbor gulls were arriving earlier each spring, and it gathered weather records, shipping patterns, and breeding data into a neat explanation that would have taken 3 specialists and a week to assemble. A civil engineer asked which bridges were most vulnerable to alternating heat stress and salt corrosion, and the system replied with a ranked list, a map, and a warning about one span that had not yet failed but had begun, in the language of steel, to think about it. The room had not changed, yet everything in it had. My mother removed her spectacles and looked at me over their rims. "Where," she asked, "is the mind in that machine?" I worked in the archive, but in those days that question was larger than my title and smaller than my pride. I was a curator of records, a keeper of sequence and source, a woman trained to mistrust what arrived without a citation. I knew where maps slept and where letters lied. I knew how empires changed names without changing habits. I could find you the first survey of the Eastern Marshes or the municipal dispute that delayed the Southern Rail spur for 9 years. But when it came to this new thing, this voice that had no lungs, and this summary that seemed to hover above 1,000 documents like mist above a river, I had only metaphors and no mechanism. So I did what archivists do when faced with a mystery. I went to the source. The source, as it happened, was on a mountain. North of the city, where the old quarry roads gave way to pine and shale, there stood a research campus that the newspapers called the Atlas Compute Center and everyone else called the House of Three Ways. It had once been a hydroelectric station, then a military analysis site, then an abandoned shell with cracked windows facing the valley. Now it had been rebuilt in glass, copper, and black stone. Coolant lines ran where water channels had once run. Fiber cables followed the old turbine conduits like roots remembering the shape of an earlier tree. I took the mountain tram at dawn. The city fell away beneath me in terraces of rooftops and smoke, and above me the house caught the first light. It did not look mystical. It looked expensive. Yet as the tram climbed through the pines, I understood why people spoke of it with a kind of superstitious respect. The place had the stillness of monasteries and the appetite of factories. Men and women went there carrying coffee and equations and emerged having altered the future by increments too small for a newspaper headline and too large for ordinary speech. At the gate, I was met not by a receptionist but by an old man in a grey jacket carrying no badge, with the unhurried posture of someone who had long ago stopped trying to impress rooms. "You are Mira from the archive," he said. "I am. Your mother catalogued the canal maps." "She did." "She was right about the terminal." I laughed despite myself. "You know my mother?" "I know the type," he said. "They are civilization's immune system." He introduced himself as Ansel, though everyone at the house called him Rector, which made him sound more ecclesiastical than he appeared. He led me through an atrium where live moss climbed a wall beside a display showing cluster utilization, carbon load, and network traffic in shimmering columns. Students moved through the hall, speaking in low, exact voices. Somewhere below us, I could hear a steady mechanical rushing, like breath amplified through the ribs of a sleeping animal. "You came to ask where the mind is," said Ansel. "Yes," he nodded. "Then I will answer the way my teacher answered me. In a violin, what makes the music? The wood, I suppose. Does unstrung wood sing? No. The strings, then. Not without tension. The bow? Not without a hand." He smiled. "Good. Most people stop too early. They point to the voice at the top and think they have found the thing itself. But intelligence in machines arrives the way music arrives in instruments. It is not one substance. It is a relation, a form made from three ways working together." He held up 3 fingers. "The first way is hardware, matter arranged so that signals can be steered, counted, and transformed at great speed. The second way is software, instructions, models, logic, mathematics, and learned parameters that tell the matter what patterns to form. The third way is interface, the meeting surface where human intention enters and machine capability returns in a usable shape." He lowered his hand. "People worship the third way because it talks to them. Investors worship the first way because it is scarce. Engineers often worship the second because it feels like thought. But remove any one of the 3, and the whole thing becomes either mute, inert, or inaccessible. And this is the 3-way form of AI? It is one good way of understanding it," he said. "Come, you should see the foundation before the voice confuses you." He led me downward. We entered the first hall through 2 heavy doors that sealed with the soft authority of submarine locks. The temperature dropped at once. The air was filtered and faintly metallic. Before us stretched a long chamber of server racks arranged in immaculate rows, each rack pulsing with tiny points of light. Coolant pipes ran overhead. Under the raised floor, power lines and network fibers crossed in invisible geometries. Fans whispered. Pumps throbbed. The whole hall gave off the impression not of noise but of disciplined effort, like an army ordered not to speak. A woman was waiting for us beside a workbench on which lay a silicon wafer, dark and shining like a fragment of midnight polished flat. "This is Jun," said Ansel. "She teaches silicon to behave." Jun shook my hand and held up the wafer between finger and thumb. "Most people think AI begins in the cloud," she said. "That is because clouds are good for hiding plumbing. It begins here." She turned the wafer so that the overhead lights caught it in bands of iridescent color. "At the broadest level," she said, "a chip is a piece of carefully purified silicon into which we pattern an absurd number of electronic devices, mostly transistors. A transistor is not intelligence. It is a switch, or more precisely, a tiny controllable gate that can help represent ones and zeros and perform logical operations. But when you place billions of them in the right arrangement and clock them and feed them signals, you get arithmetic. And once you have arithmetic at scale, you can build nearly everything else. She set the wafer down and motioned toward the hall. In old stories, power comes from dragon hearts or sacred fire. In modern machines, it comes from switching events. Gates open, gates close, charges move, voltages rise and fall, not chaos, timed change. That timing matters. She led me to a glass panel behind which technicians monitored a rack mounted with accelerator cards. People say electrons move near the speed of light, she said. That is a poetic way of noticing that electronics are fast, but it is not quite right. Individual electrons in a conductor drift rather slowly, bumping and jostling through crowded paths. What moves quickly is the signal, the organized electromagnetic effect through the system. Think less of a single messenger sprinting through a city and more of a stadium wave passing through a crowd. Each person moves only a little. The pattern moves fast. I felt immediate gratitude for her correction. The room itself seemed to approve. She touched the glass. These accelerators are designed for the sort of computation modern AI relies on. Large-scale linear algebra, matrix multiplication, vector operations, movement of tensors, vast, repetitive numerical work done in parallel. The romance disappears into arithmetic. Then at scale, arithmetic becomes romance again. I laughed. John did not. If you ask a large language model to answer a question, she went on, the miracle is not that it writes a sentence. The miracle is that a physical machine can perform the necessary numerical transformations quickly enough that the sentence appears before you lose patience. She pointed to a diagram on a nearby screen. It showed compute units, high bandwidth memory, interconnects, caches, data paths. In modern AI, moving data is often as important as computing on it, sometimes more important. A multiplication done on the chip is cheap compared with fetching the values from farther away. So architects obsess over memory hierarchy, registers, on-chip cache, high bandwidth memory, DRAM storage. Near is fast, far is slow. The geometry of knowledge matters. I must have looked puzzled because she smiled for the first time. Imagine a monastery kitchen, she said. What you use every second is on the counter. What you use daily is on the shelf. What you use monthly is in the storeroom. You would not walk to the cellar for salt every time you stirred the pot. Chips think the same way. We walked between the racks. Through small windows I could see boards dense with components, their heat shunted into liquid channels. The coolant moved with the solemn purpose of mountain rivers. Training a frontier, AI model now often means spreading a single job across many chips, John said. One chip is not enough. Hundreds, thousands, sometimes more. So we network them. We divide the work. Some hold parts of the model, some hold pieces of the data. Signals travel between them. Timing matters, bandwidth matters, latency matters, reliability matters. If one part waits too long for another, the orchestra stumbles. Then the hardware is an orchestra? It is more like an orchestra hall, the instruments, the chairs, the acoustics, and the discipline that allows everyone to play in time. The music still comes from elsewhere, but without this, nothing coherent emerges. She stopped beside a cabinet that housed a damaged accelerator board mounted like a relic. This one failed from heat stress, she said. That is another truth the public likes to ignore. Intelligence at scale is thermodynamics wearing elegant clothes. Every useful computation leaves warmth behind. Every warm chip asks to be cooled. Every cluster asks for power. Every facility asks the grid, the water system, the mining industry, the supply chain, and the climate for permission. She turned toward me. This is why the hardware layer is not just about speed. It is about economics, geography, and politics. Who can manufacture the chips? Who can power them? Who can cool them? Who can afford the capital to deploy them? Scarcity at the bottom becomes power at the top. From farther down the hall came a burst of activity as technicians swapped a unit. The servers never stopped humming. Even replacement was done like surgery on a beating heart. Jun held up a processor package no bigger than a tile. Inside this small object are more devices than there are people in many nations, she said. Each too tiny to see with the naked eye. Each not clever, not conscious, not meaningful. But arranged in the right architecture, they become a field in which software can carve behavior. She placed the package back into its tray. People look at systems like these and call them brains. I understand the impulse, but the analogy misleaches more than it reveals. Brains grow, bleed, forget, self-repair imperfectly, and run on chemistry evolved over millions of years. Chips are fabricated in clean rooms, organized around clocking and design constraints, optimized for repeatable operations, and brutally intolerant of thermal indifference. They are not minds. They are stages on which certain kinds of computation can occur. Then what am I looking at? I asked. She glanced down the hall. You are looking at potential energy for thought-like work. A city of switches. A stone foundation for something that will later sound like language. When she said it, the room changed for me. The racks no longer resembled coffins or shrines. They resembled looms before thread, amphitheaters before actors, irrigation systems before rain. At the door, Jun gave me one final gift. Remember this, she said. The public imagines AI as a talking thing because talking is what they hear. But the deepest layer of it is silent. It is voltage thresholds, clock cycles, packet traffic, memory contention, yield rates, heat maps, and fabrication tolerances. The future may be written in grand ideas, but it will be bottlenecked by distance, power, and cooling. When I turned back once more before leaving, the hall shone in blue-white rows, working too fast for the eye to follow, and too slowly perhaps for history to notice. The second hall felt warmer, messier, and somehow more dangerous. There were whiteboards in every direction, dense with matrices, arrows, Greek letters, PI diagrams, and sentences half erased in haste. Laptops stood open beside cups of tea gone cold. Screens displayed logs, training curves, inference traces, evaluation dashboards, and code editors full of neat indentation that looked to my archival eye like bureaucracy rendered in lightning. If the first hall was a cathedral of matter, this was a shipyard of abstraction. A woman with her hair tied in a pencil approached us, carrying 2 styluses and a bag of almonds. "Samira," said Ansel, "this is Mira from the archive. She wants to know where the mind is." Samira handed me the almonds as though I were the one who had been working all night. "The mind," she said, "is the wrong noun, but it is a useful wrong noun. Come." She led me to a wall display showing a live training run. Numbers ticked. Loss values stepped downward in tiny, uneven staircases. "You have seen the machinery," she said. "Now imagine that all of it is merely a very fast and very obedient city. Software is the law, the road plan, the traffic lights, the supply routes, the songs sung in the factories, and the habits by which the city turns chaos into routine. That is a large definition. It has to be. By the time an AI researcher writes 3 elegant lines in a high-level language, a whole understory has already awakened beneath them. Operating systems, drivers, runtimes, libraries, kernels, compilers, communication frameworks, schedulers, storage systems. Software is not one layer. It is a stack of agreements. She brought up a second screen, this one showing text transformed into tokens. At the level people now care about, AI software includes models, especially neural networks, that learn patterns from data rather than having every rule hard-coded by hand. For language systems, we break text into tokens, which are units the model can process. We turn those tokens into vectors, numerical representations in high-dimensional space. Then layers of computation transformed those vectors again and again. She drew a quick sketch. Input, embeddings, attention, feed-forward blocks, output probabilities. If the model is a transformer, one of its key mechanisms is attention. That means, roughly, that for each token being processed, the system computes which other tokens in the context matter most right now. Not forever, not metaphysically, just in this pass for this purpose. It is a way of letting the model weigh relationships dynamically. She saw my face and softened the language. Imagine a conversation at a long dinner table. Every sentence spoken changes which earlier remarks matter. If someone says, "Put it by the bank," you need context to know whether they mean the riverbank or the financial institution. Attention is part of how the model keeps turning its head toward the right previous words. I recognized the elegance at once. Not magic. Relevance by calculation. But how does it learn? I asked. Samira nodded toward the training curves. The model begins effectively ignorant, not empty because the architecture gives it biases and capacities, but untrained in the specific patterns we want. We show it enormous amounts of data. It makes predictions. We compare those predictions with desired outcomes using a loss function, a numerical measure of error. Then, through gradient-based optimization and backpropagation, we calculate how each parameter contributed to that error and nudge the parameters accordingly. Tiny changes, billions of times, over and over. She made a pinching motion with her fingers. Most of training is correction at microscopic scale. The model guesses, reality answers, and the model adjusts. Guess, measure, adjust. Guess, measure, adjust. Like a sculptor working in fog, learning the hidden statue by tapping stone and listening for the echo. She opened a panel showing model weights. Rows upon rows of floating point values that meant nothing to my eye and everything to the system. These numbers are learned parameters. People talk about models as though they were libraries hidden in a vault, but that image is misleading. A trained model is not simply a cabinet of memorized sentences waiting to be pulled out. It is more like a shaped probability landscape compressed from vast exposure to examples in which some continuations become more likely than others because the system has learned statistical structure. Then it does not store knowledge? It stores something, she said, but not in the tidy way a card catalog stores knowledge. It stores weights tuned by experience, patterns, tendencies, associations, capabilities, sometimes fragments, sometimes too much, sometimes not enough. Generalization is the hope. Memorization is one of the risks. She tapped another screen. A chart appeared showing benchmark evaluations across reasoning, code generation, multilingual tasks, and safety tests. Software is also where we try to turn raw pattern learning into useful behavior. We fine-tune models, we evaluate them. We add retrieval systems so they can consult documents at runtime. We give them tool access so they can search, calculate, query databases, call simulators, or operate instruments. We insert system instructions and guardrails. We measure latency, failure modes, hallucination rates, bias, robustness, and drift. And hallucination? I asked. That is what the newspapers call it when the machine lies. It is not exactly lying, said Samira. Lying implies an inner model of truth and a decision to depart from it. Most of the time, these systems fail for simpler reasons. They produce plausible-seeming output that is not grounded well enough in reality. They are prediction engines, not truth organs. If the training data is messy, the prompt is ambiguous, the retrieval is poor, or the task pushes beyond what was learned reliably, they may still continue fluently. Fluency is not the same as fidelity. That sentence deserved to be engraved on the municipal council chamber. She took me past a room where researchers were running experiments on a vision language model. On one wall, images of turbine blades, retinal scans, satellite fields, and handwritten ledgers flashed by as the system annotated, classified, and summarized. "This is why software matters so profoundly," she said. "The same hardware can be turned toward radically different ends depending on the code and models running on it. One stack helps design proteins, another flags financial fraud, another translates between dialects, another assists radiologists, another helps a child learn algebra. Hardware is capability in reserve. Software is capability in formation." She stopped at a workstation where a young engineer was debugging a training job. "Look closely and you will also see humility," she said. "The public imagines AI systems arriving fully formed like Athena from the head of Zeus. In practice, they are assembled through thousands of choices: which data to include, which objective to optimize, which trade-off to accept between speed and accuracy, openness and security, generality and specialization, what to cache, what to quantize, how to distribute across devices, which errors matter, which users matter. Software is not only mathematics, it is policy hidden inside implementation." That phrase landed in me hard: policy hidden inside implementation. In the archive, classification itself had always been policy. Which shelf a thing occupies determines who finds it. Which title appears in the index shapes what a culture remembers. Here, at scales beyond shelving, the same truth held. Mira took me to a final display. It showed a model assisting materials scientists in identifying promising compounds for heat-resistant coatings. "Here is one future," she said. "The system does not replace the scientist. It narrows the search. It proposes candidates, simulates likely behaviors, cross-references prior literature, and explains why certain structures may be worth testing. The hardware supplies the throughput. The software supplies the learned pattern recognition and the simulation pipelines. Together, they shift science from fishing in the dark towards scouting with lanterns." "And the interface?" I asked. She smiled. "Ah, the interface is why the lantern becomes usable by anyone who is not already standing in this room." As we walked out, she called after me. "One more thing, archivist. People fear that software makes machines mysterious. In fact, good software is what makes their behavior somewhat legible. The dangerous systems are not only the powerful ones, they are the powerful ones wrapped in opacity." The third hall was the strangest because it looked at first glance the least impressive. No chilled aisles, no glowing wafers, no equations blazing across walls. Instead, there were tables, microphones, touch displays, headsets, drafting pens, haptic gloves, projection surfaces, accessibility rigs, and a dozen different workstations where the same underlying intelligence appeared in different guises: a chat window, a visual planning board, a voice assistant, an augmented maintenance overlay, a legal research panel with sources attached, a classroom tutor that spoke gently and waited longer before answering, a triage dashboard that surfaced uncertainty in colors rather than false confidence in prose. A man in rolled shirt sleeves was crouched beside an elderly woman wearing bone conduction headphones. On a screen before her, a city services assistant had enlarged its type, slowed its cadence, and switched from dense paragraphs to stepwise choices. He stood and waved us over. "This is Tom," said Ansel. "He teaches systems how to meet humans without frightening them or flattering them too much." Tom grinned. "Flattery is a major interface bug." He guided me first to the simplest station, a blank conversational field blinking for input. "This," he said, "is the part people mistake for the whole of AI because it is where they touch it. They type, it answers. They conclude that intelligence lives in the sentence. But the interface is not merely decoration on top of machinery. It is the shaping surface where intention becomes actionable." He typed, Summarize all flood mitigation ordinances affecting the South Canal District. Prioritize currently active statutes and cite superseded provisions separately. The system answered in clear prose with linked sources. Tom turned to me. Notice what happened. A person expressed an intention in natural language. The interface passed that into a form the underlying systems could work with. It may route parts of the query to retrieval modules, databases, or analytical tools. It may attach memory, permissions, or context. It may decide how much to show, when to ask follow-up questions, whether to display sources, how to indicate uncertainty, and what actions are allowed. So the interface chooses as well. Always. A handle chooses the kinds of forces a door can receive. That seemed exactly right. In older computing, he continued, users had to conform themselves to the machine. They learned commands, syntax, strict sequences. That was powerful but exclusionary. Modern AI interfaces increasingly let the machine meet people in the forms people already use: language, images, gesture, voice, sketch, demonstration, correction. This widens access dramatically. It also raises the stakes because ease of use can disguise limits. He brought up two versions of the same medical support tool. One displayed a polished answer in a confident paragraph. The other showed a ranked differential diagnosis, supporting evidence, confidence bands, and links to the specific patient data and literature grounding the recommendation. The first interface makes the system look smarter, he said. The second makes the human smarter. That difference is civilizational. We moved to a station used by field mechanics. A worker could point a camera at a pump assembly, and the system overlaid likely wear points, maintenance records, parts compatibility, and a stepwise repair guide. Same underlying technologies, Tom said. Different interface. Here, the point is not eloquence. It is timing, visibility, and trust under pressure. If the worker has oily gloves, the system must listen by voice. If the network goes weak, the interface must degrade gracefully. If the model is uncertain, the alert must not look identical to certainty. Interface is where human factors stop being a soft afterthought and become engineering. At another table, a child sat solving geometry with a tutoring system. When she made an error, the tutor did not simply give the answer. It asked what she had assumed, where the angle relation came from, and whether the diagram should be redrawn. Its restraint felt almost maternal. "Why not just answer immediately?" I asked. Tom shrugged. Because the goal of the interface is not always to optimize for speed. Sometimes it should optimize for learning, memory, confidence, or agency. In education, an answer can be a theft if delivered too early. At the far end of the hall was a prototype archive console. My breath caught. It displayed manuscript images, transcriptions, linked metadata, map overlays, provenance trails, and a conversational panel that could answer questions while citing exact folios, dates, and revisions. One could ask for all references to canal dredging between two wars, then switch instantly to a visual timeline, then compare language drift in engineering reports across decades. I touched the edge of the table. "This could save us months." "It could," said Tom. "Or it could make you lazy. That depends on the design." He pointed to the citation pane. Good interfaces do not only make systems powerful, they make systems accountable. They reveal provenance. They show confidence. They preserve user control. They structure interaction so that convenience does not destroy judgment. A bad interface turns computation into theater. A good one turns it into a tool. He leaned back against the table. The deepest change in AI may not be that information can be processed faster. We have been processing information faster for decades. The deeper change is that information can increasingly be addressed in human terms and returned in task-shaped forms. It no longer waits as passive inventory. Through the interface, it begins to behave, summarizing, comparing, drafting, translating, recommending, warning, simulating, asking for clarification, and sometimes taking action through connected tools. Information becomes active. Yes, he said, not alive, not conscious, active. It moves from being merely stored to being operational. There it was. The sentence my mother had been circling without wanting to say aloud. Not that knowledge had become a ghost, but that it had become executable. Tom must have seen recognition on my face. "You work in an archive," he said. "You know what it meant when writing allowed memory to leave the body. You know what printing meant when books could travel farther than monks. You know what databases meant when records could be searched in seconds instead of days. This is another transition of that kind. We are teaching information not just to sit, but to perform." Perform what? Sometimes retrieval, sometimes prediction, sometimes coordination, sometimes explanation, increasingly whole workflows. He gestured toward the room. The interface is where the machine's competence must become legible enough for human beings to collaborate with it. Without that, the other two layers remain trapped among specialists. With it, they enter schools, clinics, courts, farms, design studios, ports, kitchens, and city halls. Ansel, who had been silent for some time, finally spoke. "And when they do," he said, "society changes not only because the tools are strong, but because their strength becomes ordinary." I might have gone back to the city that evening with only wonder and notes if the weather had remained polite. But by dusk, the mountain sky had turned the color of hammered lead. The atmospheric models had warned of an unusually intense river system moving in from the coast, but warnings in our region were as common as gulls. People respected them the way they respected old back pain, by acknowledging them and continuing anyway. At 6, alarms began sounding through the house, not panicked alarms, but the clipped tonal sequence that means attention has become urgent. A systems operator crossed the hall at a near run. Tom checked his wrist display. Samira reappeared from a side room, already talking to someone through an earpiece. Jun turned toward the atrium screens, where city maps were brightening in warning colors. "What happened?" I asked. Ansel did not answer at once. He was reading. Then, "The northern tributaries are rising faster than forecast. There may be infrastructure interactions the baseline model missed." The room changed tempo, not chaos, acceleration. The kind that reveals whether an institution has rehearsed truthfully or only ceremonially. "Come," said Tom to me. "You wanted to understand how the three ways meet. This is a poor lesson in comfort and an excellent one in reality." We moved into an operations chamber overlooking both the compute hall and a wall of live civic dashboards. Rain intensity maps streamed in from weather radar, river gauges pulsed, traffic conditions updated in real time. Power distribution nodes glowed across the valley. Cameras from culverts and embankments flickered into view. Here, at last, the three ways were not concepts, but choreography. On the lower level, the hardware clusters took in torrents of sensor data, satellite imagery, historical topography, sewer schematics, rainfall models, and transport conditions. The chips did what chips do best: transformed numbers at impossible speed, reran scenarios, passed gradients through models, processed image feeds, updated forecasts, coordinated workloads across machines without any concern for whether the consequences might flood a bakery or save a hospital. On the main level, software systems layered themselves over the raw computation. Hydrology models recalculated likely overflow points. Computer vision systems checked culvert blockages and bank erosion from camera feeds. Language systems summarized engineering notes from past flood events. Retrieval modules pulled old maintenance records, zoning disputes, repair logs, and emergency protocols. Optimization routines tested evacuation routes and pump deployment plans. A planning agent compared current telemetry with edge case historical events that no ordinary operator would have remembered to ask about. And at the front of the room, the interface stitched all that labor into forms humans could use. Maps ranked by urgency, concise decision briefs, plain language public advisories, route recommendations for ambulances, prioritized inspection lists for field crews, and alerts that surfaced uncertainty instead of burying it. Information did not merely sit in the system, it acted. A coordinator spoke without turning from the display. South Embankment variance. A voice from another station answered. Initial projection overstated risk. Updated after pulling archived reinforcement records from 1998 and correcting soil compaction assumptions. I straightened. Archived records. Tom looked at me. Your people are in the machine now. On the main wall, a canal district in the eastern flats began to pulse amber, then red. Samira swore softly. What is it? Said John. Model conflict, Samira replied. Hydrology forecast says manageable. Infrastructure degradation model says possible cascade if the old sluice gate jams. Do we have inspection records? Sparse. I stepped closer before I realized I was moving. Not sparse, I said. Misfiled. 3 heads turned toward me. The old East Sluice used to be listed under the Marsh Diversion Authority before the district merger. If you search only current district labels, you'll miss 40 years. Tom was already pulling up the archive interface. Show me. My hands moved over the console with the speed of long habit. In that instant, the machine did not replace me, it extended me. I entered the obsolete district designation, the alternate canal name used before the reclamation projects, and the bond issue years associated with the sluice repairs. The system surfaced ledger scans, engineering annotations, and a set of maintenance notes that had never been properly cross-indexed after a municipal reorganization 3 decades earlier. There, I said. A repair log appeared. Repeated complaints of debris accumulation under high storm runoff due to a partial geometry flaw in the gate housing. A handwritten note, later transcribed, warned that emergency manual override required access from the downstream side after pressure equalization. Samira fed the record into the planning system. Seconds later, the recommendation changed. Updated, she said. Field crew routed. Do not rely on automatic release. Send manual team to downstream approach before water tops the lower road. Public messaging began updating at once. Not dramatic, not cinematic, just better. Routes shifted. A depot for insulin deliveries was reallocated. 2 school gymnasiums were deprioritized as shelters when the system noted that their backup generators sat in basement rooms vulnerable to seepage. A bus corridor was reopened because the latest bridge stress model, cross-checked against archived reinforcement retrofits, showed the western spans safer than first assumed. Watching it happen was like seeing a library learn verbs. The rain struck harder. Somewhere below the mountain, rivers and drains and embankments obeyed gravity with total indifference to politics. But in the house, the 3-way form of AI turned information into intervention. The hardware gave us the speed to absorb reality as it unfolded. The software gave us the patterning and predictive machinery to turn scattered signals into structured possibilities. The interface gave officials, crews, and citizens a way to understand and act before the window closed. Still, it was not magic. At 8:17 p.m., a recommendation came through suggesting closure of Dock Road East, which would have cut off one evacuation path. John frowned. Why that segment? Tom expanded the rationale. A computer vision system had flagged possible surface destabilization from a camera feed. I stared at the image and felt the archive-trained itch of mismatch. That shadow isn't washout, I said. It's tarpaulin. There's roadwork there from last week. A human operator checked and confirmed. The camera had interpreted a sheeted equipment stack as subsidence risk. The recommendation was withdrawn. There, in one moment, the lesson completed itself. Information had become active, yes, but not infallible. The future would not belong to machine initiative alone. It would belong to the quality of the partnership. By midnight, the worst had passed. Two neighborhoods flooded at the edges, but the sluice was cleared in time. The hospital generators stayed dry, and the casualty count remained miraculously low for a storm that had arrived with such ambition. On the wall, warning red softened to amber, then green. Operators stretched. Someone finally cursed the coffee. Someone else laughed the brittle laugh of post-adrenaline survival. Ansel stood beside me, hands folded behind his back. "Do you see now?" he asked. I looked at the fading maps. "Yes," I said. The system did not know the city the way a person knows it, but it could gather, compare, calculate, and speak across scales no person could manage alone. And information no longer behaves like a shelf full of sleeping records. It behaves like a workforce. He nodded once. Exactly. That is both the promise and the danger. We sat near dawn in the atrium while the mountain windows turned from black to blue. Below us, the compute hall still hummed. Somewhere in the building, batch jobs had resumed, models continued training, interfaces refreshed, and the city's freshly surviving records streamed into long-term storage to become tomorrow's history. The house never truly slept. It merely changed what kind of wakefulness it practiced. "Tell me the danger," I said. Ansel folded his glasses. "The danger is that when information becomes operational, institutions may forget that operation is never neutral. AI systems can widen access to knowledge, accelerate science, improve diagnosis, reduce drudgery, personalize education, and help societies coordinate under pressure. They can also centralize power, launder bias through mathematics, produce persuasive nonsense at industrial scale, intensify surveillance, deskill workers, and make bad decisions travel faster." He looked out at the valley. "The three ways each carry their own politics. Hardware concentrates around whoever controls fabrication, energy, land, and capital. Software reflects choices about data, objectives, guardrails, and ownership. Interfaces shape what users think the system is doing and what kinds of dependence they form. When the layers align badly, people are not merely inconvenienced, they are governed." I thought of the terminal in the archive answering with perfect tone and imperfect certainty. So the future depends on stewardship, always. But now at machine speed. He sipped his tea. "There is another temptation to resist. Because the interface feels conversational, people leap to grand metaphysical claims. They ask whether the machine is conscious, whether it wants, whether it dreams. Those questions are not always foolish, but they can distract from the more urgent and answerable ones. Who built it? On what data? For whose benefit? With what energy cost? Under what constraints? How is uncertainty shown? Who can challenge its outputs? Where are the humans still needed, and where are they being quietly displaced?" I smiled. "That sounds like something my mother would ask." "Then your mother is still fit for public life." We sat in silence for a while. As daylight filled the atrium, the house seemed less like a temple and more like what it was. A vast machine for turning matter, mathematics, and human intention into capability. Yet the old metaphors had not become false. They had simply sharpened. The hardware layer was stone and lightning, the disciplined physical substrate, the city of switches, the thermodynamic price of speed. The software layer was script and river, code, models, objectives, learned weights, flows of data, correction, compression, and pattern. The interface layer was window and bridge, the place where the silent depth of the system rose into human reach. Only together did they produce what ordinary people would call AI. And because they now worked together so well, information itself had begun to alter its social role. That thought stayed with me all morning. For centuries, information had mostly behaved as stored memory. Then, with search engines and databases, it became rapidly retrievable memory. Now it was becoming something more like active cognition support. Not a mind in itself, but a system that could combine retrieval, transformation, simulation, and communication into useful performance. A scientist would ask for candidate molecules, and information would propose. A doctor would ask for differential diagnoses, and information would prioritize. A teacher would ask where a student was stuck, and information would infer. A farmer would point a camera at blighted leaves, and information would compare weather, soil, disease patterns, and local treatment constraints. A city planner would ask what happens if sea level rises 18 centimeters while transit demand shifts east, and information would not merely fetch reports, but model consequences. We were entering a period in which information would no longer wait passively to be searched. It would begin to meet us halfway. That, I realized, was what had unsettled me in the archive. Not that a machine could answer. We have built answering machines of one kind or another for decades. It was that the answer now arrived shaped to purpose. The system could move among records, abstractions, and tasks. It could translate between forms. It could compress 10 hours of reading into 3 paragraphs, then reopen those paragraphs into source-back detail, then turn that detail into an action plan for a flood crew or a study guide for a child. In one sense, nothing miraculous had happened. Transistors still switched, gradients still descended, interfaces still mediated. In another sense, civilization had acquired a new organ, not a replacement for judgment, but a prosthetic for the manipulation of complexity. Ansel must have seen some of this on my face. "You are thinking about libraries," he said. "I am thinking," I answered, "that for most of history, information was a warehouse. Then it became a catalogue, then a network. Now it may become a workshop." He smiled. "Good. That is well said." When I returned to the city, the archive looked both older and younger than before. The oak drawers were still there, so were the ladders, the skylight, the smell of paper and polish. But now I could see the terminal not as an intrusion from nowhere, but as the visible lip of a deep 3-layered structure reaching up from mountain hardware through software stacks into the reading room, where ordinary language touched it. My mother was at her table, indexing an estate map that no one had requested in years. "Well," she said without looking up, "where is the mind?" I set my coat over the chair and considered my answer carefully, because in families as in archives, phrasing matters. "It is not in one place," I said. "It is in the relationship between 3 places." She raised an eyebrow, which meant I had not yet earned dinner. "The first is the hardware," I continued, "the chips and processors and memory systems that make rapid computation possible. They are not minds. They are engineered matter. Billions of tiny switches arranged so signals can be transformed at scale." She made no objection, so I went on. "The second is the software, the code, models, optimization methods, learned parameters, retrieval systems, and rules that shape what those machines actually do. This is where pattern learning happens, where errors are measured, where models are trained, where capability takes form. And the third? The interface, the place where we ask and it answers, where human intention becomes a task, where results become usable, where sources, uncertainty, and control ought to be shown if the people building it have any decency." My mother set down her pen, and together, I said, "they make information behave less like storage and more like performance." That pleased her enough to hide it. Over the following months, we changed the archive, not by surrendering it, by teaching it new posture. We built an interface that cited every claim down to the page, because archives should never speak without showing their mouth. We trained specialized retrieval systems on local records and legal histories, but kept expert review over any public-facing interpretations. We added provenance trails that let researchers see not only what the system answered, but how it assembled the answer. We created modes for scholars, city clerks, school children, and field engineers, because interface is not merely aesthetics but social architecture. We designed the tutor to ask before it told. We designed the legal assistant to separate active law from superseded law. We designed the city history guide to say, "I am uncertain," when the evidence blurred. And perhaps most important of all, we changed our own jobs. Archivists became less like warehouse keepers and more like stewards of an active commons. Our labor shifted upward, from locating every document by hand toward curating datasets, validating metadata, correcting historical misclassifications, designing retrieval schemas, auditing outputs, and teaching users where machine convenience must still be answered by human care. The young researchers who came in no longer began with, "Where is file 7B?" They began with, "Can the system compare every infrastructure report before and after the embankment reforms and highlight changes in failure language?" And because we had built the layers well, the answer was often yes. But I also learned to cherish the system's limits. Sometimes it was brilliantly useful, sometimes it was lazily fluent. Sometimes it missed that a district had changed names 3 times across a century of annexations. Sometimes it proposed a tidy conclusion where the historical truth remained jagged. Those failures did not disappoint me as much as they instructed me. They reminded me that AI was not a spirit descending into matter. It was a human-built arrangement of layers, each with strengths, blind spots, costs, and politics. Years later, when students would visit the archive and ask how the age of AI truly began, I would not start with chatbots or with headlines or with investors chanting valuations over slides. I would tell them a story. I would tell them that in one era, information mostly waited. It lived in books, ledgers, tapes, and databases, and human beings had to go to it, search it, interpret it, and carry it back into action by hand. Then, as computation grew, software matured, and interfaces became natural enough to feel conversational, information began to cross the room toward us. It learned to summarize what we had no time to read, compare what we had no capacity to hold side by side, simulate what had not yet happened, and translate expert complexity into forms ordinary people could use. Not because it became magical, because 3 layers finally began to work as one. At the bottom, chips and processors turned physics into reliable numerical labor. Above them, software transformed raw computation into learned models, analytical pipelines, and adaptable logic. At the top, interfaces opened a door through which anyone, not just specialists, could ask, inspect, direct, and collaborate. That was the 3-way form: stone, script, speech, foundation, pattern, touch, matter, method, meeting. Call it what you like. The names change less than the structure. And what future does this usher in? A future in which information is no longer merely an artifact, but an actor in our systems. A future in which science is accelerated not because genius becomes cheap, but because pattern search, simulation, and synthesis become abundant. A future in which diagnosis may begin earlier because weak signals across scans, labs, and patient histories can be combined before a tired clinician would have time to do so alone. A future in which education can become more personal because explanation can adapt to the student's confusion in real time. A future in which design tools can generate options, test constraints, and help people think through consequences before committing steel, money, or medicine. A future in which bureaucracies, long tyrannized by paperwork, may finally allow citizens to state what they need in plain language and receive guidance that reflects the actual maze behind the counter. And also, unavoidably, a future in which bad actors can automate fraud, propaganda, exploitation, and surveillance unless we build laws, norms, and institutions equal to the power of the systems we unleash. The 3-way form does not guarantee wisdom. It guarantees leverage. Whether that leverage enlarges human dignity or corrodes it will depend on choices made at every layer: which hardware gets built and who controls it, which software gets trained and on what data, which interfaces invite reflection and which encourage surrender. Sometimes, late in the evening, after the readers have gone and the skylight has gone dark, I still sit at the archive terminal and ask it questions whose answers I already know. Not because I mistrust it, though I do a little, and not because I trust it, though I do a little. I ask because there is something historically moving about watching a civilization teach its records to move. I ask for the first survey of the eastern marshes. It fetches it. I ask for every mention of sluice failure before the merger of districts. It finds the old names as well as the new. I ask for a comparison between a 19th century engineer's flood anxieties and our own. It gives me a paragraph, then the sources, then a map. And for a moment, across decades, paper and silicon cooperate. When that happens, I think of the mountain, of June in the cold hall of switches, reminding me that speed is physical and expensive, of Samira among the equations, showing me how errors become learning through patient numerical correction, of Tom in the room of windows, insisting that the difference between domination and usefulness may lie in how uncertainty is shown, of Ansel asking what makes the music in a violin. The answer, of course, is not wood alone, nor strings alone, nor bow alone. And in AI, it is not chips alone, nor code alone, nor interface alone. It is the form they make together. That is why the future now feels uncanny to so many people, not because information has grown a soul, but because it has acquired posture, tempo, and reach. It has learned through hardware, software, and interface to stand up from the shelf and meet us in the world of tasks. For good builders, that is an invitation. For careless ones, a warning. For the rest of us, it is a new literacy. To understand the three layers beneath the sentence on the screen, and to remember that every answer we receive is the visible crest of a deep engineered sea. My mother, for her part, eventually made peace with the archive terminal. She never trusted its first answer, which is why I trusted her more with it than many younger men who worshipped its speed. Once, after it had helped us reconstruct a missing parcel history by cross-referencing survey errors, canal ledgers, and probate files, she patted the side of the machine with a look that was almost affection. "Useful," she said. Then, after a pause, "but only because somebody taught it to show its work." That, I think, is as close to Zen as our age is likely to get.